when I talk to organizations today about inclusion and what it means for leadership or for your recruitment and what it means to enable organizations to leverage the power of diversity, often people say, yeah, that's important, but, and this but always ends with the same excuses. Oh, we just went through a crisis, or we just have an upturn and we have to see where it goes. Or people just say, well, I don't really see the benefit in it because it doesn't bring profit to the table, or does it? And that's what we're going to talk about today. We have an international keynote speaker and expert on this topic here with us today. Hello and welcome, Jackie Handy.
Hello, Niels. Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you very much for taking the time, and I'm getting straight into it. Because when I prepared for this podcast, I of course asked people in advance, what are your issues? And many people say, when I start with diversity, especially at the moment due to the situation and COVID and what's going to happen in the future, people say, oh, we have different problems at the moment, don't we? What do you think about that statement?
Well, I think it's all about priorities, to be honest with you, Niels. And we know that most of the time in business, the people within your organization are the ones that will solve your problems for you and help make you profitable. And so, you know, by looking at ways to actually embrace the population within our organizations and make sure that they all feel valued, that they feel like they have a voice, that their contribution matters, that there are systems and processes in place that encourage collaboration and deeper levels of understanding between our differences, then actually I see nothing more important than the people within your organization as a priority right now, and making sure that they're all kind of a series of cogs that are well oiled and moving in tandem together. And that's what's going to help an organization solve any current problems brought about by external crises and forces.
So when people now say, let's say, diversity, yes, we thought about it, or we maybe had an alliance, or we have an alliance already, or people even say, well, at the moment, we're not talking about it at all. And I know that one of your major points is that enabling organizations to leverage the power of diversity. That sounds very powerful. The problem will always be, how do I do it? And especially, where do I start? So when organizations now say, I think we have to address it, but we have no idea where to start and we don't want to do it wrong. So what shall they do?
Okay. Well, first of all, they have to look within, and they need to look at where they're starting from. And, you have many people that talk about dials, continuums, and, and actually, in a way, I'm no different. So I would say that, most organizations, most people, when they're thinking about how diverse they are, they perhaps have their rose-colored glasses on that really suggests where they would like to be as opposed to where they're starting from. And there are a number of phases that I would consider people perhaps would fall into. And the first would be a phase that basically diversity is not really on their radar, or they don't really believe that it's something that is important, a little bit like the example you just mentioned at the start there. And so they don't really see that becoming more diverse and importantly more inclusive will benefit their business and their bottom line. Then you have the people that they recognize some of those benefits. And so what they're doing is they're making sure that they are compliant, that they have as much diversity as possible in order to make sure that to the outside world, they're doing the right thing. And or at least give that opinion. And so what tends to happen in organizations like that is that potentially what they're doing is they're looking at ways to bring in people from less represented groups into their business. But actually, once those people get into the organization, they realize that there's not really an inclusive culture. So they don't stick around, they don't perform well, they're disengaged and so on. As you move around the dial, you then start to have organizations where you'll have pockets of inclusion and pockets of that earlier phase of where they don't really see it's something for them. And so there's that kind of disconnect across the organization, and your experience as an employee within it will be influenced by which manager or which department you work within. And so there's, as I said, there's that disconnect. It's quite erratic. And then finally you get to when there's a real combination and compliance, but in a good way, to not only diversity but commitment to inclusion, you get to a place where eventually you can start to look at really embedding inclusion across your organization, whereby you almost don't need to have diversity and inclusion labeled as a thing. And that's my dream for the world, is that we don't actually need diversity and inclusion specialists like me, because, the world is already inclusive. So where do you start? You look at and you reflect. And even as I've talked about those phases there, perhaps your listeners will be thinking, right, where would I like to be, and where actually am I, and where is my organization? And from there, you can start the process of, okay, so what are the things that actually, by concentrating on, we can have the biggest impact? And also, what are the things I need to educate myself on? Because there's so much within diversity and inclusion that we often find we assume rather than we really understand. And one of the things that I focus on with people is creating a deeper level of understanding, not only just about diversity and inclusion as a whole, but how to demonstrate inclusive behaviors to ensure that everybody around you truly feels as though they belong in that environment, in that organization, and then they will truly thrive.
Excellent. And of course, when we now just make the step to recruitment, because I received quite a number of statements where people say, yes, we need to be more diverse, but what can we do when we get people applying for our sales jobs? 95% are men. That's not our fault. We can't do anything about it. Do you think this is true, or do you think that organizations need to do more to, let's say, make a different kind of pattern happen when it comes to people applying for jobs within their organization?
Well, you probably already suspect that I would say that organizations need to do more. I think they would certainly benefit from doing more. It's very easy to blame the outside circumstances or anywhere and anyone else. Right. So, yes, they do need to do more. They need to look at, first of all, where are they advertising? I mean, these are just a few quick tips, but, whereabouts are they advertising? What kind of demographic tends to read or view that content? Because that's what you're going to attract, right? Also, what language are you using? And I don't mean, is it English, is it German, or so on? I mean, what kind of gender neutrality? And this is just for gender, but what neutrality is being used in language? Terms such as competitive, aggressive, and dynamic, and so on, are often associated with male respondents, whereas compassionate and empathy and caring and assertive can be much more associated with feminine words. And so there's not a huge psychology around this, and I want to be clear on that. So I'm not necessarily giving science here, but certainly the thought processes are that a use of balance when referring to looking at language in your job advertisements could make a difference. Now then, also look at the recruitment process. So how are you interviewing people, and how are you selecting people even for interview in the first place? It's commonly known that, when you can have blind interviewing or blind selection rather, so, taking off names, age groups and so on and so forth could be helpful. But ultimately, we have to appreciate that eventually you're going to interview them, and whether that's on a virtual platform or face to face, you're going to see the person. So the actual identity, as it were, of the individual is going to be perhaps much more obvious when you meet them. So there has to be things in place to help people minimize their biases, and creating systems and processes that do that for you will make that much easier for the individual. So, for example, perhaps having certainly a panel or at least one other person in the room interviewing, ideally who is different in terms of their color or their gender or, any other facet, if you like, of their identity, who can give a different view. making sure that the questions that you ask are first of all legal, which I think is quite important in some organizations. They still, cross.
What are examples for illegal questions? I think that is because I had a couple of people who say sometimes I don't know if I'm allowed to ask this, so I don't ask. What are examples for illegal questions?
Okay, well, certainly, the law is different country to country, so I'm talking about UK. But in terms of things that you can't ask, you can't say, would having children stop you? So somebody that has children, and perhaps they've volunteered that, but would having children stop you from traveling as part of this job? You can't ask that question. The question that you change that for instance, would be, part of this job requires traveling, and is that okay with you, or how would you fulfill that? You certainly can't ask people if they have you got a family, or are you planning a family? You can't ask that of people. So these are those are just a couple really off the top of my head, but there's plenty that that might be asked that really, I think if anybody that's listening is about to recruit and they're not sure, they really should take some advice on that. Because actually I believe that most of these questions are asked with positive intention. But actually that naivety and ignorance, I suppose, in a polite manner, but, can cause people to make mistakes that become costly, at best to their reputation, at worst, they find themselves taken to court for discrimination.
Excellent. And to wrap this interview up, there's, of course, one big question many people have. They say, I really want to address the issue. I really want to make it happen in my organization. But the problem is that senior management just blocks me out, because they think when we admit now that we haven't done anything and it's the year 2020, it looks like a weakness. So we better don't talk about it at all, rather than admitting we haven't done anything about it so far. So it's all about, where do I really get started? To wrap this whole interview up, what are Jackie Handy's top 3 tips, where to start now and how to convince senior management on joining you on the journey?
Okay, so the first I've already mentioned, so that's really easy to answer. Get a sense of where your organization is starting from, their starting point. The second thing would be to recognize the benefits of inclusion in your business. So, look at what would be enhanced through having more inclusion. And I don't just mean that you'll see more diversity. That's only part of it. It's the inclusion that matters. So how much better would you collaborate? How much better would you solve problems? How much better would your productivity go up from your workforce? How much better would the retention of your team be, and ultimately your turnover from that? So really get a sense of the end results. Like many things in business, start with the end in mind, and then you can start to create the strategy. And I think that step 3 is then creating a strategy. Now, my philosophy is twofold. One is keep it simple. Small steps are still progress. So think about small steps that can be taken. And of course, if you have the backing of your leadership team, you're always going to be more successful with a kind of holistic approach. But nevertheless, small steps individually are still progress. And the second thing is, think about not just sheep dipping everybody through an unconscious bias training session. But my focus with organizations is to think about the core behaviors that need to be demonstrated in order to become more inclusive. And a very quick example for you, that one of those might be quite simply understanding. And that behavior crosses so many boundaries in business. But from an inclusion perspective, when I understand not just the color or the gender or the able-bodiedness of my colleague, but simply that individual as a fellow human being. When I understand them deeply, their needs, their identity, their values, that helps me build much deeper relationships with them and acts as a springboard to propel that relationship into somewhere much stronger, much more collaborative, much more productive. So think about behaviors. I've got a little book that I've put together just as a sort of reflective piece. And that is based on behaviors. And it's called The Little Book of Belonging. It's your weekly guide to inclusive habits. I'll just get that in there, Niels. But, and that would be my thoughts, my 3 tips really, to say, think about those behaviors.
Perfect. That is excellent advice for everyone listening to this podcast. Of course, I'm going to put your contact data in the show notes of this podcast so people can get in touch with you directly. And for this interview, there's only one thing for me left to say. Jackie, thank you very much for your time.
Thank you, Niels.